It is a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to be with you today and to share. Now, as I see, there are our professors on a very high level, and then there are some of us who want to just know how to do it. So, as a first introductory thing, I will. Oh yeah, please stop me when I uh, go on too long. See, so the first point I wanted to then share is the method of doing this. Now, when I started way back in 1987, it was one of those funny things that I was frowned upon when I went to the archives. What is this man now searching for? It wasn't part of the, shall we say, brown colored Khoi slave tradition those days that people do their family research. Why I wanted to do it? We went to settle in Namibia, but we came back. And when I was in Namibia, I actually missed my family. And I decided that when I'm back in town, which we came back next year, when I'm back in town, I was going to visit my family, find out more, and so on. So I started with the oral history. That is, approaching people and asking them. Then I got contradictory stories because some of our people, according to them, came from Kimberley, and some of them came from Plettenberg Bay. Hello? Is it all right? Can you hear me? Okay. And then some came from Plettenberg Bay, and others had other stories. So I had to then find a written evidence that may or may not correspond with the contradictory stories. And it was also very important in our day. We are of that previous generation, Chandra. When we asked our parents something, we would have been chased away, because children have to be seen and not heard. So we didn't have the courage those days to ask them. But when I was now a bit older, I was already a teacher by then, and family did start opening up to me. So then I realized I had to have a structure where I should put in my detail. So the structure which I discovered, I joined the Genealogical Society of South Africa, was a family tree. So this one here, you can see this one, it starts with Aubrey, and then my parents, first my dad, then my mum, and then their parents, my father's parents, my mother's parents, and so we could go on until I got to the first Springveldt in Worcester, who was Aaron, or Aaron. Now, I also got my mother's family here, and then as you can see, there are still just gaps, you know, but that is also to reassure you that this is an ongoing process. We're not just going to wake up one day and everything is going to fall in place. At this stage for my life is also reassuring that there's something else to get up for tomorrow, right? So having arrived at the oldest member, or the senior member, the first Springveldt, the next step was then to establish a family register. But now, how did I get here? After the oral research, I went to churches. Now, our Rhenish missionaries, which Mansell has referred to earlier on, Rhenish church ministers had very exact details of baptisms, of marriages, of deaths, and also of people leaving the church, and a little bit more about how they have decided to baptize a certain person or not another person. So in some of the records, I would find this one, for example, of some of the relatives, and a little bit further, also one of my great grandparents who had a commentary next to in general comments that he had a changed heart for a long time, and I was at that stage then, 1946, ready to make a commitment to the Lord. And that was and is still for me one great encouragement, that people as those days had to make a public confession of their Christian belief, and they did that in the church. Now, from the records in the church, from there I went into the archives, and in archives in the Western Cape and Rowland Street has a lot of information for us. So there are documents about births and deaths, there are documents about wills, and also the so-called death notices of people, especially if they had property. A major help is that at some point, Home Affairs had dropped some files with dates with births and marriages, and those are also stored at the Western Cape Archives. Now, that helped me to then also eliminate the legends, the stories that people were told, because our history was then just communicated verbally, because our parents, grandparents were so busy making a living that they didn't have time to write up stuff. And I don't know how it was in other communities, but in our community, when I was a youngster, we would play around when the family got together or friends got together. Our parents got together, and then the ladies would normally sit around and talk, and they would discuss everybody else and how people are connected, you know. And the fathers would normally sit around and play dominoes or cards or things like that. But the mothers would not allow us into that conversation because it was adult conversation. So we unfortunately lost a lot, and many of our people now struggle because they haven't listened. Because when we start getting interested in our heritage, then our ancestors, who can tell us they are not there anymore. But in the groups that I have, I would normally recommend that we develop a kind of relationship with not just the elders in our family, but also the elders around, our grandparents, neighbors. And once they realize that we are genuine and we're not here to sensationalize the past, then they are normally very prepared to share with us. And in that sharing, in that discovery of our past, we actually uncover quite a lot. When I, for example, came to Aaron, my grandfather's grandfather, when I came to Aaron, it was such a feeling. I was overwhelmed. I drove up to Oudtshoornweg, and I sat there in the car, and I felt so moved. I was crying. And then after that, I could go home and could share it with my wife. I have found my progenitor of Worcester, the first Springveldt. Now, that had me to go and then search in the church records to confirm that he is the right Aaron. And the further connection was that what I discovered that day was that he was the daughter of Rosette, and there's Rosette's name, as a slave of a certain person. Now, it's just for procedures that I've covered his name. And then Aaron, here at the bottom, Aaron was born on the 13th of February 1818 as a son of Rosette. Now, these things you discover in the archives, that is what I discovered, and that is what really touched me, because I know he was Rosette's child. Although in the church registers, which I first had, in the church registers, they would normally write a Christian name or a baptism name. And that can be quite confusing because although a name was Rosette in the slave register, that was the name that was given to the slave, most probably by the owner, and or by the parents with the permission of the owner. And then we can also go through auction lists and so on to find at what point did that person actually join that farm, or when did that person's parents join the farm. So I could, for example, go back, and therefore we also go further than Aaron. I could not find Aaron's father, and I could not find Aaron's mother, but because Aaron would be registered in the name of his mother only. As Nigel has Mansell said earlier on, we so often forget the mothers. And the Latin expression mater semper certa est means the mother's identity is a fact, whereas the father is not a fact, that is pater incertus. And for me was also quite a lovely experience where we now, this one, to have gone into my mom's detail to get my mother's line right up to Mariana Peterson. And then I did for myself, did the DNA testing, and I wrote a long story about this DNA testing. But on my mother's side, suffice it, it's probably good to say that this company also went onto the international databases and discovered there were 6 people with an identical DNA as myself on this mitochondrial side, 2 in India, 1 in Sri Lanka, and 3 in the Maldives, which put it beyond doubt that Mariana Peters, my mother's line, has been a slave from that area or else a mother. So that gave me assurance of we belong somewhere. I know who I am. That coupled with Aaron's identity, and Aaron's identity shows that he is definitely of Khoi background. And then we speculate about this Khoi background, that on the face of it, his mother, Rosette, had the right to be intimate with anybody. So she got married later to John Kibedu or Johannes Kibedu, whilst Aaron chose the surname Springveldt when he got baptized. And that led me on to another line. There was Springveldt and the Khoi clan of Captain Dora, who, for example, came to the castle in 1693 to negotiate with the governor at that stage. And then we find under the Griqua, I found the Springveldt name, and also under the Hessequas in the Genadendal area, there was Springveldt. And one of those Springveldt, for example, was where he accompanied the missionary from Genadendal to Inon to establish a new congregation there in the early 1800s. I think I have, here, for example, it's a little map that comes from the book on Genadendal, where we have Paulus Springveldt's name, and then on the same list, his next door neighbor is Buzak, and then there's also Windvogel there next to them. So it's a journey that gave me then a broader perspective. It was not just me. I am sure of my own identity. My family can be sure of their identity. I can be sure of my Christian identity, but I can also be sure of my Khoi identity. And now the world makes sense, because now my perspectives develop. And my Christian perspective, my worldview, still the same. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. But now my neighbors are not just me and my wife although the minister will say your wife is your first neighbor, right? But this, it went further. And the realization now is that I can start seeing my ancestors in their context. And this is the major meaning of the genealogical research for me, is that I can start projecting myself into the history. The history becomes real. It's now not anymore the 200 dates that we had to regurgitate, the facts that we had to learn from the typed notes of the teacher or lecturer that had to include all his spelling errors so that we could get more than 80%. It is now, history is about me, my ancestors, and how their social, political, religious influences played a role in their reality. And this is what we try to share also with my students. I would like to see that in every family, there's at least one person doing that research. And that I have said in the past, and I normally take my students in first time into the section, the inventory section, where there a volume of 17 thick books like these, research on 99% of our white families in South Africa, which was sponsored by the then government and people who were also volunteers. But we have to do it ourselves with our own funding, and we have to be wise how we go about with our information. It's also one of the reasons why I ask my students to be very careful when they go into these international websites and put down the information there, that they can also know that they must also be aware that that information is also accessible to everybody else, and copyright and so on would also be affected. Now, of the students, I am glad to say that Danny Titus, he is now not so well. Also ask you to say a special prayer for him. I do it every day. Danny Titus has initiated, when he was the executive person on Arteka for culture, and he wanted to include the brown people, as he calls them, colored people, Khoi, Griqua, into the Afrikaanse taal en cultuurbeweging and vereniging. And so Danny and the Arteka Fair asked whether I would start training people. And that's how Shanda and I then met. And lots of other people. At this stage, there are 50 people actively busy with their family trees. After a certain period, we started off with 6 months, later on 9 months, later on 12 months. After a certain period, we then have an exhibition. And that exhibition is then the first opportunity for the students to actually share amongst other interested people, their own family that they invite to this exhibition, to share what they have learned and how they have come about, to get the facts on the table for the family. One of my recommendations is that when people have done this, that they also do the after the funeral thing. You know, we normally have tea after the funeral, obviously now after lockdown, and then the family meets, and then everybody says we must get together before the next funeral. But that our genealogists can then use that opportunity to do a presentation, whatever, especially you, Charlene, you guys are very clever with technology, to do it, and then so to become known as the genealogist of the family and the families. And the one thing leads to the other. When Mansell talked early on about the minister, MC Foss is his name. Yes. A remarkable person, born again Christian, going down, yeah, he's from the Bok family and so on, and going out to the Netherlands as the first Cape Townian born. His grandmother was of the slave background, and going out as the first South African Cape Townian to become a minister in the Netherlands, with his on his heart to bring the gospel to what they called those days the slaves and the heathen. Now he grew up as a burgher. His parents were burghers. That means they were citizens. They were officially white, you know. And so he had this. And then my reading of he wrote the book on his own. It's one of my favorites also, on his own life. By MC Foss, on his own life, his own biography, and how he struggled with certain, like, political issues, for example. And politics will always come into the story. He was interested in saving the souls of people for the Lord. But the situation those days was that farmers were reluctant to get their workers baptized and saved according to the Christian principle, because there was the statutes of Amsterdam, of India, statutes of India, which suggested that anybody who was baptized had to be freed. So at some point, MC Foss had to make a very difficult decision, and that is to align with the government who allows him to be a minister, to align with the Boere who would say, okay, you can baptize our slaves, but they must still keep their condition as slaves. So that was then proved by the government of the time, and we had to wait until 1834 for emancipation on the 1st of December. Now, I think I have covered most of it. Yeah, something about the Khoi and something about the slave ship that I put here. And then the main thing also for me here, which I've left out, is when we get down to our progenitor. Now, Aaron was in the first Springveldt there in Worcester. He was baptized on the 31st of March, 1850. And his children will be the second group here. Then the children's children will be here. The grandchildren, so the great grandchildren. So I have circled Niger. We have talked earlier on about starting with ourselves, like here, and going back, and then getting there, and then going this way. So I am here, Aubrey, and my sister's brothers, and then my children are there, but then my father and mother are there, then my grandfather and grandmother, his parents, and then eventually the progenitor of Springveldt of Worcester. Now, one of his grandchildren came to Cape Town, and the standard thing in Cape Town is people don't call you Springveldt, they call you Springfield. So Jan Jacobus Springveldt became John Jacobus Springfield, not John James, John Jacobus Springfield here in Cape Town. And it was wonderful. Of course, one of his great-grandchildren also incidentally joined the groups. And so they had a wonderful family reunion. And this is also something lovely for me, is that many of the students are actually driving family reunions. There's a Mauritius lady, there's, just like a Geldernees. There are quite a few of our people doing their families and getting the families together. Cleophas there. Unfortunately, Cleophas passed away earlier this year. after he's achieved principalship. So sad about that. But he has done his bit. He has done his journey. That journey, all of us do that journey, and all of us get to our own specific connections with our ancestors and learn to love them. And that the last thing that this brought me to, the last level of this opening up of my heart, is actually where I get to that point where I realize that we get boxed into a certain doctrine and dogma by governments who are in control. And there will be certain things that will be allowed to be taught in schools. And now is the time for us to actually look at the multifaceted history, the different angles of our history. And for people of color, of indigenous people, Khoi, Xhosa, Zulu, Sotho, have the right and liberty to actually reconstruct not just our family, but also reconstruct our history. To look at it and make the history our own. And all these different facets for me has made me realize that when we go deeper into it, we actually realize that we are all people with strengths and weaknesses. We have adopted certain new traditions, our ancestors have, but basically we're all flesh and blood, and we share the same present context. And it's up to me, not to tell other people how to deal with their present context, but it's up to me to deal with my present context in the principle of loving the Creator, that's in all our main religions, and caring for our neighbor like ourselves. And I'm sure we can build a better South Africa in that way. Genealogy is the first step. Thank you. Thank you that I could talk.
Thank you so much. Oh, so much to herkou.